Hello and welcome to another match in round 2 of the public sector debate competition. I'm Aniki Clark and I'm the host for this match. We just saw a most exciting match between the Real Estate Board and the Cannabis Licensing Authority, and the Cannabis Licensing Authority won that match. We're happy to have you join us for this, another exciting match here in the competition. And in this match, today, we are having the Passport, Immigration and Citizenship Agency, PICA, as the proponent, and the Tourism Product Development Company as the opponent, and they will be debating the MOOT, be it resolved that South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process was an effective model for reparatory justice. Big MOOT, that's enough. Wouldn't you agree? Let's give the teams a round of applause. Because taking on this MOOT is definitely no easy feat. But before they get into the arguments, we'll ask them to introduce themselves, starting with Team Proposition, PICA.
Hi, good morning. I am Paulina Mackenzie.
Morning, my name is Kurt Ball.
Good morning, my name is Mark Mullins.
Thank you so much, Team PICA, and I now turn over to Team Opposition, TPDCO, to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Desmond Saunders Jr.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Shauna Carnegie.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ashley Onfroy.
Thank you so much, Team Opposition, Team TPDCO. And at this point, I will invite the judges from the Jamaican Association for Debating and Empowerment, or partners, to introduce themselves.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Javon Downey, and I'll be serving as the chair adjudicator for this match.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kenisha Nelson, and I will be one of your wing adjudicators this morning.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lacardiego Nelson, and I'll serve as a wing adjudicator for this match.
Thank you so much, judges. So we're no longer strangers, right? We know each other. And at this point, I will hand over to Javon, who will marshal the match. And best of luck, teams. It's a best of 2, right? So at the end of this round, the top 16 teams will advance. So we look forward to an exciting match. Best of luck.
All right, so we thank you, Aniki. And right before we get into the competition, the match rather, let's just briefly revisit the rules. So you're allotted your speaking times of 7, 6, and 5 minutes respectively. Remember, there's protected time, meaning no point of information can be asked. That will be indicated at the start of protected time with a bell, and when you're entering your final minute with another sound of the bell. When you're spoken for the total allotted time, the bell will ding twice, after which you're allotted a further 15 seconds to wrap up your presentations, and then the bell will ding continuously to indicate that you're out of time. We'll also have 2 periods of cross-examinations, and we will examine the rules further when we get there. So without further ado, let's welcome the first speaker and side proposition. Hear, hear.
Imagine Nelson Mandela. After 27 years in prison, he stands on the balcony of the Union Building, newly elected in South Africa's first democratic election. The world cheers, but he feels the weight of a broken nation pressing down on his shoulders. A country divided by apartheid. Neighbors are fearful of each other. Trust eroded. Families grieving in silence. Justice demanded, but not yet delivered. The world braces for bloodshed. What is Mandela thinking? He chooses not revenge, but reconciliation. And from that thinking, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, is born. A bold and unprecedented step towards reparatory justice. Ladies and gentlemen, honorable judges, and esteemed members of the opposition, good day.
I rise in firm affirmation of the MOOT. Be it resolved that South Africa's truth and reconciliation process was an effective model for reparatory justice. As the first speaker for the proposition, I will define key terms and show that the TRC, while not effective, fulfilled the core goals of reparatory justice: truth-telling, acknowledgement of harm, and laying the foundation for national healing and unity. Let's begin by clearly defining terms. According to the United States Institute of Peace, a truth and reconciliation process is a state-sanctioned effort to uncover past human rights violations, recognize victims, and promote healing and accountability. The UN Rights Office defines reparatory justice as justice that repairs historical harm through truth-telling, acknowledgement, compensation, and institutional reform. With this understanding, let us now examine why South Africa's TRC stands as an effective model of reparatory justice. At the heart of reparatory justice is the recognition of harm. The TRC prioritized this through public testimony. Over 21,000 victims came forward to share their stories, many broadcast live on national television. One of the most powerful was the case of Stephen Biko, the anti-apartheid activist who died in police custody in 1977. For years, officials denied responsibility, but the TRC uncovered the truth and gave it a national platform. This was not vengeance. It was about restoring dignity, acknowledging suffering, and allowing for psychological and emotional healing. That fulfills a foundational pillar of reparatory justice and offers a replicable model for post-conflict societies around the world. Another key achievement is that the TRC allowed South Africa to transition peacefully without spiraling into retribution. Preparators who made full and honest disclosures were eligible for amnesty. Controversial, yes, but also deeply strategic.
Point of information.
Not at this time. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, chair of the TRC, defended this by appealing to Ubuntu, the African philosophy of shared humanity. As he said, and I quote, "Without forgiveness, there is no future." Thus, this was not a weakness. This was wisdom. The TRC didn't aim for courtroom punishment. It aimed for restorative justice. Justice that brings people face to face with the truth and fostering healing. Take the case of Amy Beale, a white American student murdered in the township in 1993. Her killers were granted amnesty, but what followed was extraordinary. Amy's parents forgave them and even worked alongside them in the Amy Beale Foundation. That is what true reconciliation looks like.
Point of information.
Not at this time. One clear indicator of an effective model is the extent to which others choose to adopt it. Since the establishment of the TRC in South Africa, over 40 countries have created truth commissions inspired by this approach. Notable examples include Canada, which examined abuses in the residential school system from 2008 to 2015. Rwanda, which addressed the genocide crimes committed during the 1994 genocide. And Argentina, which investigated forced disappearances during the military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983. That kind of replication proves the TRC's global relevance and adaptability.
Point of information.
Not at this time. The TRC had its limitations, particularly with only partial implementation of its financial compensation recommendations. However, it is created It created a permanent public record of apartheid crimes, which helped shape one of the world's most progressive constitutions in 1996. Since then, South Africa has managed to hold free and fair elections, a notable achievement for post-conflict nations. The TRC was not a perfect solution, but it was a powerful beginning and an effective model. During a discussion on world affairs years ago, I met a woman who is Muslim, who made a profound statement that aligns perfectly with my perspective. She stated, "We are imperfect people serving a perfect God. No model is flawless, but South Africa's TRC was bold, honest, and it inspired the world, proving that healing is possible without hatred. And this is the essence of reparatory justice." I rest my case. Thank you.
All right, so we thank the first speaker on side proposition for a spirited opening to this debate, and now we invite the first speaker on side opposition. Guys, here.
The apartheid system robbed people not only of their rights, but of their livelihoods. Reconciliation without restitution is meaningless. That's a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, chair of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Adjudicators, opponents, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Before I get into my substantives, I want to note a few things that the proposition said. Side proposition, we do agree with you, first speaker, in noting that the TRC was not effective. You further defined reconciliation or reparatory justice, that is, as efforts towards repair. We assert, however, that it is outcomes and not efforts. Additionally, the proposition described 1994 South Africa as a broken nation divided by apartheid. We argue that South Africa is still a broken nation in 2025, divided by injustice. The proposition claims that South Africa's truth and reconciliation process was an effective model for reparatory justice, so effective that other nations should adopt it. The opposition respectfully disagrees. Mr. Speaker, we assert that the crux of this debate requires teams to assess the full reparatory justice process in its entirety, and not just the commission, right? The commission does not constitute the full process. We argue that South Africa's truth and reconciliation process is not aligned with international benchmarking standards for reparatory justice, right? It was never intended to create real reparatory justice in the first place. It failed to achieve the true corrective measures, and therefore it cannot serve as an appropriate model for other countries, other jurisdictions to adopt. We will present 4 key flaws in the South African TRP, and that stands for the truth and reconciliation process. As first speaker, I will show that the process was misaligned and it was flawed from the very inception. Our second speaker, Shauna, will compare the apartheid and post-apartheid realities, highlighting accountability failures further compounded by impact shortcomings. Our third speaker, Ashley, will close with empirical proof that this process did not achieve justice and is therefore woefully ineffective. That is core to this debate. Firstly, we must answer the question, what constitutes an effective reparatory justice model? And did the South African TRP have these elements? Did they successfully implement them? No, they did not. Reparations experts such as William Darity Jr. and Vernon Shepherd define reparatory justice as a process that includes legal, social, economic, and psychological remedies, not just acknowledgement of harm, but repair. So effectiveness of a model then means that the framework or the system is in place, is functional, potent and actively achieved, not accepted, what is set out to do, and therefore in its current state is an example to follow, copy, or imitate. In this case, an effective reparatory justice model has 7 core elements: truth and accountability, material reparations, legal accountability, structural reform, victim participation, symbolic recognition, and measurable healing. We have created a matrix, Mr. Speaker, with these 7 indicators of reparatory justice as outlined by the United Nations Human Rights Committees and 6 other renowned expert bodies. And we've juxtaposed same with the 6 factors of the South Africa's TRP. The results are damaging. Of the 48 real measurable indicators in this matrix, the South African TRP only achieved 4, 2 of which were merely symbolic. How can a model not accepted? How can a model be effective and replicable if the international standards if by international standards it is inherently flawed and failed miserably to meet even the basic indicators of success in corrective measures? Secondly, the South African TRP cannot be an effective model for reparatory justice because it was never intended to create real reparatory justice. What do we mean by that? It was not a product. Mr. Speaker, let us critically assess the context in which the South African TRP emerged. It was not a product of moral reckoning, but a strategic concession forced by crippling international pressure, including sanctions and embargoes imposed by the over 25 countries by the late 1980s. The South African TRP was a knee-jerk reaction, a forced political response to isolation and pressure. When under pressure, governments act quickly, not always wisely. The TRP was not born of a fully inclusive or carefully designed framework aimed at repairing systemic harm. This political compromise meant that the TRP was designed to avoid prosecuting perpetrators or redistributing wealth, fundamentally undermining its role as a true model of reparatory justice. This matters because the very word reparatory comes from the Latin reparare, which means to repair. If from the get-go, the main objective had nothing to do with repairing, but simply moving forward and saving face, how can we then use it as the hallmark for restitution, healing, or justice? How can this be a model? The answer is simple: it cannot. To summarize, the South African TRP is an entire process, not just the Commission, and its other factors were either weak, absent, or completely flawed. The TRP is not aligned with international benchmarks of reparatory justice, and the TRP was inherently flawed because it was never created to facilitate real reparatory justice in the first place. Mr. Speaker, the TRP was not a praiseworthy approach, nor was it revolutionary. It was not an effective reparatory justice model and must be seen as a limbic reaction. It was a compromise, and while compromises can bring peace, they do not always bring reparatory justice. Thank you.
All right, so we thank the first speaker on opposition for our opening to the debate. We will now transition into the first period of cross-examination, and this is where we allow team opposition to field 3 questions to team proposition, questions capped at 10 seconds and responses limited to 30 seconds, and after which we'll flip the arrangement and take questions from team proposition to opposition. Team opposition, are you ready?
Team proposition. You may claim that the South African TRC is worthy of being imitated and a good model used by others. But isn't it true that countries like Germany, Chile, and Colombia altered and rejected key elements, especially amnesty, in their models?
All right. We must say that countries like Colombia and Chile did have the TRC model. Not only that, repeat your question again for clarity.
Isn't it true that countries that looked at the model rejected key elements and completely altered the model, including the rejection of amnesty, which you touted is an effective aspect?
the
What we're debating is the TRC commission, the TRC that came up with the TRP, the process. It's a model. So what the countries did was to use that model as a foundation for developing their own model.
Therein is your flaw because the TRP begot the TRC, not the other way around. Second
Yes,
question.
questions only.
Second question. Even Desmond Tutu, the chair of the TRC, admitted the government's failure to implement the recommendations. If the Commission's outcomes were largely ignored, doesn't that suggest that the model lacked enforceability and effectiveness?
No, that did not mean that the model lacked effectiveness and enforcement. Because Desmond Tutu, what the model did was the basis and the core of the model was to get persons' voice to be there, to bring the atrocities of the apartheid system to the world and to bring healing to South Africa. So also to build on that, a country that cannot heal from within, cannot move forward. And the TRC was not intended for other aspects. The government was who was responsible for.
All right, thank you very much. Final question, side opposition.
Proposition, you have defined the TRC as a full process of reconciliation and truth. Is that to suggest that justice was achieved merely by the volumes of report produced by this commission? You have defined the full process of truth and reconciliation as the TRC, the commission. Is that to suggest that justice was served with just the production of that commission, which was to produce reports with recommendations?
The commission, in its year-long deliberation, going across the length and breadth of South Africa, interviewed and gave a voice to South Africans. South Africans who were on the apartheid side and even the resistance to the apartheid system, gave them a voice. And from that, they created recommendations for the South African government to implement. The model in itself did what it was set out to do. And we are here.
All right, thank you very much. That's time. So now we'll entertain the questions from side proposition to opposition.
Team opposition, are you saying that the TRC had no value in promoting reconciliation?
That's not what we're saying. We're saying, though, that it was a start of a process. And it's a 6-step process which then folks should focus on implementation in health, in education, in solving environmental injustices, in legal considerations. All of these things should have followed the TRC's work. And it's evident that those things did not happen.
So what you're really trying to say to me is that the model of reparatory justice did not do what it was supposed to do. So what is it that you propose that balances truth, justice, and stability?
What we're suggesting is a fulsome approach, a comprehensive approach, one that is designed based on the specific circumstance. And if you have really delved deep into this issue, you'll realize that apartheid was one of the most brutal events ever faced by humankind. And so we are suggesting that in response to that, the process, the full process, should have been one that was potent and effective.
All right, so you're saying to me also that you're discrediting the healing that persons experience. Victims publicly gave their perpetrators during these healings. Do you dismiss this?
No. While survivors valid truth and acknowledgement, the TRP still failed to deliver full justice, accountability, and reparations, which are essential for genuine healing that you posit happened and systemic change. 67% of the participants, even after the commission and the process, had not improved their lives in any meaningful way and said that they faced psychological harm as a result of the process, not justice.
All right, so we thank both teams for an interesting period of cross-questioning, and now we'll invite the second speaker on side proposition to continue their case. Hear, hear.
esteemed opponents, our first speaker argued that South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process represented an effective model for reparatory justice, not because it was perfectly executed, but because it introduced a transformative framework for acknowledging harm, restoring dignity, and setting the stage for societal repair after years of government-sanctioned violence. While it is true that South Africa did not fully implement material restoration, that failure lies in political will, not in the model's design. It is the socio-political and economic failure of South Africa's government at the time that failed this effective model. In other words, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process was an effective model that was failed by government inefficiency, corruption, and a horde of other political inadequacies. So, honorable judges, did the South African government fail the effective Truth and Reconciliation process? It absolutely did. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is not what we are debating today. Friends, there are those who would have you believe that the TRC failed because there was no full material compensation. The TRC played its part in highlighting the need for material and structural reparation for which the government, not the TRC, failed to implement. Moreover, reparatory justice is not just about money. It is about recognition, healing, systematic repair. As the scholar...
Point of information.
Not at this time. As the scholar, Margaret Urban Walker said, what victims want is not just compensation, but a moral acknowledgement of what happened to them. Like our first speaker argued, the Truth and Reconciliation process was not impunity. Instead, it was a trade of truth for justice. In a complex mass prosecution, we ask opposition, would you rather have 1,000 trials supported by lengthy investigations and possible sabotage, teetering on the possibility of racial war, or 22,000 testimonies of those affected by the travesty of the previous 30 years? By allowing perpetrators to publicly accept
Point of information.
Not at this time. By allowing perpetrators to publicly accept responsibility for their violent actions and giving voice to the survivors of those violent acts, TRC produced a peaceful transition and a healing and forgiveness. Despite obvious hiccups like the absence of political willpower and poor implementation, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process was an effective model for reparatory justice. So effective that many countries, Germany, as you would have mentioned, New Zealand, Finland, Colombia, subsequently adopted this effective model for reparatory justice to address their own systematic atrocities. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process recognized the truism that individuals who perpetrated or experienced trauma are more likely to inflict pain on others. Undoubtedly, unresolved emotional wounds can manifest in negative ways, leading to anger, resentment, cruelty. Just look at what is happening in the Congo, Kenya, Uganda, Zaire, Zimbabwe, or even what is happening in South Sudan today. My worthy opponents, why some critics of the South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation process may point to the failure of the inept government to fully implement all the model's plans, we can objectively agree that the Truth and Reconciliation process was an effective model since it literally stopped the hemorrhaging across the nation. It is for this reason, that it is a model for the world, because whether we are focusing on perpetrator or survivors, hurt people, hurt more people. Healed people, heal more people.
Thank you very much. That is time. So we thank the second proposition speaker for his spirited contributions to the debate. And now we welcome the second opposition speaker. Here.
Good afternoon to my adjudicators, opponents. Mr. Speaker, let it be clear. The South African TRP failed to achieve true corrective measures, and corrective measures is the very basis on which reparatory justice is formed. How did it fail? Because the process did not deliver lasting redress for the millions who suffered under apartheid, those who faced land dispossession, economic exploitation, racism, poverty, rape, torture, and murder. Even 3 decades after apartheid, most black South Africans remained trapped in structural inequality. Today, white South Africans, just 7.3% of the population, still control over 72% of farmlands. Racial inequality in wealth, education, and opportunity continues. This is not justice, and certainly not reparatory. This is because from its genesis, the TRP was international appeasement under duress. Its intention was to keep the property class connected to the rest of the world and its market. Before I get into my substantives, let me address some points that were raised by the opposition. The model's design, if it is effective, involves mitigating factors to ensure implementation. By saying that the TRC was unable to ensure implementation, you admit that it is structurally faulty. Remember, the Commission is a part of the process and not the process itself. Team proposition confuses the two. The debate is about the process and not the Commission. The other point is, who is most likely to inflict pain on others are those who have never been held accountable for their initial crimes. I continue.
Point of information.
Not taken. The inclusion of amnesty in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission fundamentally undermined justice for apartheid victims. It created a gross imbalance. Perpetrators were shielded while victims were re-traumatized, undercompensated, and ultimately failed by the very system meant to acknowledge their pain. I categorically argue that amnesty as a central mandate of the TRP, as mandated by the Commission, comprised justice, left the victims cynical and their dignity wounded. The TRC promised truth, accountability, and reparations. But what victims got was truth without consequence, accountability without justice, and reparations without substance. As we would have said in Jamaica, puss in a bag. Why were victims who had already endured systematic violence asked to prove their suffering, while perpetrators were rewarded with immunity for strategic confessions? Perpetrators, once they could convince the Amnesty Committee that their actions were politically motivated, were granted full amnesty, regardless of the brutality involved. They were never required to pay restitution, symbolic or material. This imbalance is best illustrated by the case of Similane, a young woman abducted and tortured by apartheid police. Some of her abductors received amnesty. Others didn't even apply. Yet not taken. Yet it took 36 years for her family to get legal recognition that she was presumed dead. And only after they provided irrefutable evidence. This is not justice. It's bureaucracy in the face of suffering. Even powerful figures like President de Klerk escaped full scrutiny. When summoned by the TRC, his testimony was evasive. Though found complicit in human rights abuses, he obtained a court injunction to censor parts of his testimony from the final report. Was this process a pursuit of the truth or a calculated shield for the powerful? Let us be honest, Mr. Speaker. The TRP prioritized brand South Africa over individual justice, economics over equity. Some say this trade-off was necessary, but I ask, for whose benefit? Can a country claim reconciliation if it buries the voices of its most harmed? Should peace come at the cost of truth without a consequence? Not taken at this time. Let us look at material reparations. Of the 22,000 verified victims, the TRC recommended ran 138,000 per person. The government only paid 30,000 rand once to fewer than 17,000 victims. Meanwhile, rand 1.5 billion in corporate fines from apartheid-era profiteers was never collected, let alone distributed to the victims. The state enriched itself on the backs of racial oppression, but failed to invest in repairing that damage. The TRC did not just fall short economically, it failed psychologically. One of the key indicators of an effective reparatory justice model is involving victims in the design of the model. The victims had no say in this regard. Victims who testified often suffered increased trauma, with 43% reporting greater distress even a year later, as reported in the Journal of Peace Psychology. Yet no one offered mental health assistance. Police brutality remains rampant. 5,000 complaints in 2021. Xenophobic violence and systematic racism still plague South Africa today. Why? Because core institutions like the police and judiciary were never reformed. Let us not forget that systematic reform is a key component of real reparatory justice. So I ask, was this enough? Can a nation move forward if so many of its citizens remain stuck in a past and never properly addressed? Reconciliation without justice is not healing. It is enforced silence. I thank you.
All right, so we thank again the second speaker on side proposition for her contributions to the debate. We will now transition into the second and final period of cross-examination, where once again we'll invite side opposition to field questions, 3 questions rather, to side proposition. Just a note, teams, ask questions. Remember, you're limited to 10 seconds, so cut the lead in and get straight to the question in and of itself.
Why were corporations that profited under apartheid never held accountable or required to contribute to reparations? Doesn't this suggest that the model protected power rather than redistribute it, which is the core to reparatory justice?
We want to reiterate that the TRC was made its own recommendations. But the failings was not as a result of the TRP, but as a result of the government's failure to implement those recommendations.
In contrast to South Africa, Argentina and other countries pursued prosecutions. Why have these been considered more balanced examples of reparatory justice rather than truth and accountability with no real accountability?
South Africa had a legislative framework from which the TRC was born. Argentina did not. Hence, they sought prosecution. And from the prosecution, they never got the full truth of all that happened. The TRC was so designed to understand cause, nature, and the extent of which the atrocities took place under apartheid. Argentina, to this day, have not gotten to that point.
All right, final question.
Apartheid was as much about economic dispossession as political violence. How can a process be reparative if it fails to address land inequality and wealth concentration, issues that arise in the first place?
In a very brief answer, you cannot place a value on human experience. You cannot place a value on human life.
All right, so we thank side proposition for their questions and opposition rather for their questions, and now invite the questions from side proposition.
In your deliberations, you mentioned having a lasting redress. We'd like to ask you to place a value on that lasting redress.
To answer that convoluted question, value is perceived by human experience, which connects us to your previous response. And that value is tightly connected to how persons, the people who were affected by apartheid, how they perceive the benefits. And in several surveys, over 60% of those who participated said that they did not feel as though justice was served.
You mentioned in your earlier deliberations that the TRP achieved 4 things. You further went on to say 2 were symbolic. Yet later on you mentioned that it was completely flawed. Can you make that correlation to help us to understand?
So we noted a matrix of 48 indicators and then mentioned that South Africa's TRP only satisfied 4 of those. Now, if you want to look on a pass mark, that is only 8%. And so we can conclude just by those statistics that it was inherently or completely flawed.
Next question. Can you name any mechanism that has brought more reconciliation in similar circumstances?
In fact, we can. Sierra Leone included retributive justice as a major part of its truth and reconciliation process after the civil wars in 1991 to 2002. And that brought about many feelings of justice. It was not a slap on the wrist for the perpetrators. They were held accountable by the Sierra Leone's special court.
We thank both teams for an engaging period of cross-examination, and we will now transition into a 1-minute break to allow the teams to put the finishing touches on their reply speeches, after which we will resume with the opposition reply speaker, followed by the proposition replied speaker. That 1 minute starts now. All right, so that bell signals time. We now welcome the third speaker, the reply speaker, and side opposition. Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, you know what? Yes, the TRP was effective, very effective at that. It was effective in only rescuing brand South Africa. It allowed them to keep the bulk of their markets, but at the expense of providing the foundation for real social change. The proposition said commission, 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 but they have not mentioned the other 5 flawed elements of the overall process, and this debate is about the process of reparatory justice. It did not account for legal accountability, nor did it address systemic reform. Side proposition clearly does not understand what is implied when the words reparatory and justice are joined together. They are suggesting that after all the demonstrated atrocities and unrectified atrocities of apartheid, we should all hold hands, spin 3 times, and sing Kumbaya and Ubuntu, peace. What a sin thing. We, as the opposition, are here to prove that the process as done by South Africa did not, does not, cannot be considered an effective reparatory justice model. By its design, it was not created to facilitate real reparatory justice. Did the South Africa's TRP's instant coffee approach yield results? Yes. It terminated the threat of political and economic isolation, but this is not equivalent to efficacy. It was a brutal compromise of justice for fleeting global acceptance, a disgrace, and a spit in the face of human rights everywhere. Two, not accepted.
Out of order.
The United Nations condemned the South Africa's processes amnesty for truth model as inconsistent with international reparatory justice norms. Mr. Speaker, we outlined this for you clearly earlier. Did the TRP ensure both truth and legal accountability? No. Did it create a pathway for sustainable and suitable material reparations for victims? No. Did the TRP pursue the historically sound route to structural reform? No. Did the TRP establish, monitor, and evaluate a framework for measurable healing and psychological assistance? No. Did it significantly incorporate victims in designing the reparatory justice process itself? No. The South African TRP failed to achieve 44 of the 48 internationally recognized baselines of effective reparatory justice. Mr. Speaker, that means that in a global test of reparatory justice efficacy, it scores an unsatisfactory 8%. And the proposition wants us to believe that 8% is an indicator of success worthy of being replicated? Seriously? Are you for real? This is what is worthy of replication. Sierra Leone's process of reparatory justice scores 72% on the international matrix. Rwanda scores 64%, Germany 53%, and guess what? All those countries with successful reparatory justice models have categorically rejected South Africa's TRP as worthy of being replicated. They have all cherry-picked aspects of the model and discarded amnesty. None accepted it as it is, underscoring its fundamental ineffectiveness. South Africa has not moved significantly away from the turmoil that it was in 30 years ago. Mr. Speaker, political and economic power are hallmarks of reparatory justice achievement, and just yesterday, CNN reported that the black South Africans who make up 80% of the country's population own only 4% of private property, and less than 1% of this amount is arable or business land. Therefore, the TRP failed, and it failed miserably on one of its core points. Let us conclude on this matter, Mr. Speaker. The South African reparatory justice approach lacked adequate victim participation in its design. It was flawed from inception. It was a political compromise. It failed to implement 44 of the 48 globally accepted hallmarks of success. It offered amnesty rather than legal accountability. Its recommendations were ignored or underfunded and therefore points to an inherent flaw in the implementation process. Most importantly, South Africa remains, to this day, deeply unequal, and victims remain distressed and disadvantaged, adjudicators, members of the public. It does not matter what side proposition wants to fabricate at this point. Past and present dictate that the South African Truth and Reconciliation process is a worldwide example of all things to be avoided, not replicated. The South African Truth and Reconciliation process is a cautionary tale, not an effective reparatory justice model. Thank you.
We thank the reply speaker and side opposition for closing out the debate in fiery style on that side of the house. And now we invite side proposition, the reply speaker to close out the debate in likewise manner in totality. Hear, hear.
We have heard from the opposition. We've heard what they had to say. But let us remind ourselves of the facts. What truth is. What actually pertained. What we have come to know as being factual. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a groundbreaking restorative justice body established to help heal the country after apartheid ended. What was Nelson Mandela's thinking at the time of the establishment of the TRC? Here's a man who was unjustly imprisoned for almost 30 years. However, when he was released, he held no grudge and forgave his oppressors. This allowed healing to flow for himself, his family, the African nation, and indeed the world. Reconciliation followed because truth was made known. The Bible itself teaches, we shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. So let's remind ourselves of the facts and details. The TRC was established in 1995. It had a mandated period that covered human, politically related violations which occurred between March 1960 and May 94. It was chaired by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, with submissions being made in 1998 of October, followed by those in 2003. What were the purpose and objectives? Establish a complete as picture as possible of the causes, nature, and extent of the gross violations of human rights which were committed. Facilitate the granting of amnesty to persons who made full disclosure of all the relevant facts relating to the acts associated with a political objective. Establishing and making known the fate or whereabouts of victims and restoring human and civil dignity, and compiling a report providing a comprehensive account as possible of the activities and findings of the Commission. There are 3 committees, and we know them: Human Rights, Amnesty, and Reparation and Rehabilitation of Victims Committees. The outcomes we have clearly established. Over 22,000 victim statements were collected. There are over 7,000 amnesty applications that were received, 1,200 of which were granted. It focused on crimes committed by both apartheid-era government forces and the liberation movement. There are some principles of the impact based on restorative rather than retributive justice. That's critical. It emphasized truth-telling and forgiveness over punishment. It is credited with helping South Africa avoid civil conflict and build a more inclusive democracy. What would we rather? The bloodshed or the healing that the TRP brought about? Clearly, the TRP was not about money. There are no perfect or flawless systems. We are imperfect people living in an imperfect world. Notwithstanding, the TRP brought about healing. It was established for a purpose and achieved its objectives. That's what makes it an effective model worthy of emulation. In my own experience, I bring to bear on this. I hold this newspaper clipping from The Observer. My own daughter, 5 years ago, was shot in her head. But as a result of the forgiveness, we were able to come out with healing and feeling that healing. The TRP remains one of the most significant examples of transitional justice and a model for dealing with historical injustice through dialogue, truth, and national healing. I thank you.
All right, so we thank the proposition reply speaker for his submissions, and we invite Aninki.
Thank you very very much, teams. Another round of applause for the teams. They certainly delivered well on that MOOT. And just to remind those of you who are very excited on our social media platform, the MOOT, be it resolved that South Africa's truth and reconciliation process was an effective model for reparatory justice. And the teams that debated that MOOT, we had PICO as team proponent and TPDCO as team opponent. And I'm sure the judges have a task on hand, which is to deliberate and then advise us after that deliberation, the winners of this match. For those of you who are storming up the conversation on YouTube, continue to keep the conversation going. We have just a few minutes while we wait on the judges' deliberation, so stay tuned. Thank you very much, teams.
All right, so welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to an exciting match. So, as the chair adjudicator, the enviable task is mine of delivering the oral adjudication. So, just a quick recap: the moot for the match was: be it resolved that South Africa's truth and reconciliation process was an effective model for reparatory justice. In proposition, we had past speaker, and in opposition, we had TPDCO. So, let's get into it. Central to this match is an understanding of what does reparatory justice looks like. So from proposition, we got an idea of how did this occur. It gave us a brief introduction of what was happening at the time and what led to the creation of the truth and reconciliation process and the commission that stemmed from it, right? And they gave us an insight. They gave us insights into why it was started and how it occurred. But from side opposition, we got this understanding that in as much as we understand what side proposition is claiming to have happened, they told us that it wasn't effective because central to an effective reparative justice model are certain key tenets and certain key elements, and it was not present in South Africa's iteration of their reparatory justice model. So they said that really and truly the effectiveness that we are here to talk about never materialized, ladies and gentlemen. So with that understanding, setting up what we would refer to as the key clash in the debate, we want to look at the area where the debate really turned. And the area was really covered by certain questions. So one of the first questions is, how was truth effective in the grand scheme of things? Did the truth improve the standard of living for the people that were affected by this period? And out of side proposition, we got an emphatic no. They said that 67% of persons who were impacted, their lives did not change for the better. On side proposition, though, they argued that, listen, 22,000 people got to tell their story, and that is important. So which one do we weigh more? Just is the telling of the story or recounting what happened enough to restore dignity? Side opposition argues that yes, it is. Side proposition, rather, argues that yes, it is important. Side opposition says, okay, we accept that people are to tell their stories and that is important, but telling their stories is not effective if inherently nothing changes. And they argue that nothing changes because there's still xenophobia happening in South Africa, and they tell us a whole world of other issues that still persists because of, by and large, the ineffectiveness of the model that was utilized for reparatory justice. Another question is, how were the truths collected used by the government, right, to benefit, again, the citizens? Side proposition tells us that these things, these truths were so important and so effective that over 40 countries have established truth commissions, and they gave us examples. They said Canada, Argentina, and Rwanda, and this global replication proves that it is relevant and it is adaptable, and thus that makes it effective. But on side opposition now, they are telling us that, listen, these countries, they did not accept the model as it is. They rejected a key component of the model, which was amnesty. And I want to just share with us generally when we come to these debates, I know it is a bit difficult for us to pivot and engage in the arguments that are actually put forward in the debate because we have pre-prepared speeches, but it is crucial for any team that especially hopes to win the debate to engage with arguments as they are presented and not just stick rigidly and rigorously to what is already pre-prepared, because the area of amnesty was a key clash in the debate. And this side where we got that central to the reparative justice model was amnesty, but side opposition came and they told us that amnesty was really not for the benefit of the people. Only persons that benefited from this amnesty was really and truly the persons in power and the persons who were the perpetrators of what was happening. So they were the only ones that benefited from amnesty, and there was no engagement on the argument of the amnesty and effectiveness of the amnesty and whether that undermined what the model was instituted to correct, right? So we as a panel of judges bought the claims and the holistic mechanization that was proffered by side opposition on the area of amnesty. Generally, again, just another rule of advice for this team and all the other teams here. The reply speaker has a specific role in the debate. So the role of the reply speaker is to listen to the debate and summarize accordingly, identify the thematic areas and the thematic clashes, right, and advance your team's case, right? So it's not required for the reply speaker to put forward new ideas. So no new claims or no new points should be brought forward in the reply speech. The reply speaker can come with new examples or new explanations for points that were already made, but to introduce entirely new points is out of the spirit of the debate, right? So with that said, the team that won this debate is Team Opposition Tourism Product Development Company. They end on 289 points, and we have Team Pika ending on 255 points. The best speaker for the match was Mr. Desmond Saunders. Thank you, teams. If you require any further feedback, we are available as a panel of adjudicators. I will now hand over back to Ms. Clark. Yes.
Thank you very much. Let's hear it one more time for the teams. They did a wonderful job, and I'm sure we're leaving here more informed, more educated about the truth and reconciliation process in South Africa. Remember, it's the best of two rounds. So at the end of the week, we'll be able to share with you teams, the top 16 teams, but by virtue of winning 2 of your matches, you are assured a place in the next round. And we encourage you to stay tuned to the debating competition as we discuss issues that are not just of national importance, but also of global importance. Thank you very much for watching, and come back at 2 o'clock for another exciting match in the public sector debate competition.